Jimmy said, Rodney, that's not true. And then Rodney called you, and you said, no, Rodney, that's not true. But the Lord's told me what to do with Rodney, and I dusted my feet off, okay? Doesn't mean God bless him, go do his thing, but now I know what I'm dealing with. And Marcus had to deal with Rodney before too.
But just to clarify,
there are things y'all don't know.
But just to clarify,
Rodney has done and said that your dad was furious about.
I'm sure.
So,
but just to clarify, like I know he loves you. Rodney gave her
Jonathan, we don't need to bring
a very generous gift.
It doesn't matter.
After my dad passed, $100,000. So
Yeah.
he loves her.
Yeah.
So
What does it look like when a woman who spent her entire adult life broadcasting truth to billions of people loses the ability to receive it herself? What happens when the very warnings she would have preached about from her own studio, the red flags, the counsel of trusted friends, the voices of those who love you most, arrive at her own doorstep, one after another, and she looks at all of them and answers with a single word that shuts every door and ends every conversation? That word was fear. And this is the story of what was built and what was destroyed when it became the only answer Joni Lamb had left to give. In the months leading up to the marriage that fractured the Lamb family and sent Daystar television network into the deepest crisis of its 30-year history, it was not as if Joni Lamb heard nothing. She heard everything, from her children, from her colleagues, from a fellow widow who wrote her a personal letter out of genuine shared grief, from one of the most recognized revivalist voices in the American charismatic world, who came to her building and delivered a warning directly to her face. She heard all of it. She dismissed all of it. And on June 10th, 2023, she married Doug Weiss anyway. Before we go any further, a brief but necessary note. Everything in this video is drawn from publicly verified sources, including the Roys report led by investigative journalist Julie Roys, the documented testimony of Jonathan and Suzy Lamb, Pastor Valerie Hartwell's publicly shared widow-to-widow letter, where accounts reflect personal testimony or opinion, they will be identified as such. Where facts are documented, they will be stated clearly. This story deserves to be told with precision, because the people it involves, and the millions of people who financially supported the institution at its center, deserve nothing less. Key search phrases right now to find this story: Joni Lamb, Doug Weiss marriage warnings, Rodney Howard-Browne Daystar, Pastor Valerie Hartwell letter, Joni Lamb spirit of fear, Doug Weiss divorce timeline. To understand the full weight of the warnings Joni received, you first need to understand the timeline of how Doug Weiss arrived in her life, because that timeline alone was enough to give serious pause to anyone paying careful attention. Marcus Lamb, Joni's husband of nearly 40 years and the co-founder of Daystar Television Network, died on November 30th, 2021, from complications of COVID-19. He was 64 years old. The grief was real, and it was public. Joni appeared on air, spoke with evident difficulty about losing her partner of 4 decades, and the broader Daystar audience mourned alongside her. The ministry kept broadcasting. The family tried to hold together. And in those earliest months after Marcus died, there was every reason to believe that Joni would take the kind of time that grief demands and wisdom requires. Then, on January 27th, 2022, 58 days after Marcus Lamb drew his last breath, Doug Weiss filed for divorce from his wife of more than 30 years. Her name was Lisa Weiss. The divorce was finalized on May 31st, 2022, less than 6 months after Marcus's death. Doug Weiss was, at the time of this filing, a licensed Christian psychologist, the founder and executive director of Heart to Heart Counseling Center in Colorado Springs, Colorado, and the author of more than 40 published books on topics including sexual addiction, marriage restoration, and intimacy. He had appeared as a recurring guest on Daystar's programming. He was known to the Lamb family. He was not a stranger who wandered in from outside. He was an insider. And 58 days after Marcus died, he filed to end his own marriage of over 3 decades. The concerns that began forming in the hearts of Jonathan, Suzy, Rachel, and Rebecca were not abstract theological debates. They were grounded in specific, practical, and visible observations. Doug had just left his wife of 30-plus years. According to former clients of his Heart to Heart Counseling Center, as compiled and published by the Roys report in a detailed investigation, the intensives offered at his center had left multiple women feeling more traumatized than when they arrived, feeling blamed for their husband's infidelity, gaslit for asking questions, shamed for their emotional responses, and pressured into compliance they did not freely choose. The professional credibility concerns were real, documented, and troubling. And there was something that went beyond even that. This was a man who had built an entire career, a nationally recognized brand, and a 40-book library around helping other people save their marriages. His professional identity was inseparable from the idea that marriages could and should be fought for and restored. And yet here was that same man ending his own 3-decade union within months of a prominent and wealthy widow's husband's death and presenting himself as the right partner for that widow. The people closest to Joni could see exactly what that picture looked like and what it implied about how and when the emotional connection between them had begun to develop. Jonathan Lamb later described the moment when the family collectively tried to bring their concerns to his mother. It was not a calculated ambush. It was a series of genuine, urgent, loving conversations. And what happened in those conversations is one of the most revealing details in this entire account. Joni Lamb, the woman who had spent 30 years on television talking about discernment and wisdom and listening to the Holy Spirit, sat across from her own children while they poured out their hearts, and she pointed at them. She said, in Jonathan's own documented account, "All I hear coming from you is a spirit of fear." She pointed at each of them in turn. Fear, 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 fear. And then quickly left the room to board a plane to New York. There was no real engagement with what her children were saying. There was no genuine wrestling with the substance of their concerns. There was a label, a dismissal, and an exit. Consider what that moment meant for her children. They were not strangers raising theoretical objections. They were her son and daughter-in-law, her adult daughters, the people who had given their professional lives to the ministry she and Marcus had built together. The people who had just 4 months earlier lost their own father. And in the moment they needed her to stop and truly listen, she named their grief as a spiritual defect, called their discernment a problem of faith, and walked out the door. But it was not only her family sounding the alarm, because in February 2023, 4 months before the wedding date, Rodney Howard-Browne came to Daystar. Born in Port Elizabeth, South Africa, on June 12, 1961, Howard-Browne came to the United States in the late 1980s and became one of the most prominent revivalist preachers in American evangelical and Pentecostal circles. He and his wife Adonica co-founded Revival Ministries International and the River at Tampa Bay Church in Florida. He was not an outsider to the world Joni inhabited. He was a respected peer, a fellow builder of Christian ministry infrastructure, someone whose voice carried genuine weight inside the charismatic landscape that Daystar had always occupied. He was not someone Joni could easily categorize as a jealous critic or an uninformed observer. And yet when he came to Daystar in February 2023, he did not come to offer congratulations. He came to warn. According to Jonathan Lamb's public account, Rodney Howard-Browne was direct and unambiguous. He told Joni to her face that her relationship with Doug Weiss was biblically wrong. He told her that if she moved forward and married Doug, she would be living in sin. And he told her plainly and clearly that if she proceeded with this marriage, he would not return to Daystar. He would not appear on the network again as long as Doug Weiss was her husband. Jonathan described it by saying he was one of the voices that put the fear of God into the room, someone who came with full pastoral authority, delivered a clear biblical warning, stated a clear consequence, and did it all directly and openly, not in a whisper behind closed doors, but to her face, with her children present. That is an extraordinary act from a recognized ministry figure. It is not a private concern muttered in a hallway. It is a prophetic confrontation delivered inside the institution, being warned, with a named consequence attached. Rodney Howard-Browne, by the account of those in the room, could not have been clearer. He had gone on record, in person, before witnesses, and Joni Lamb heard every word of it. 4 months later, she walked down the aisle. But even before Howard-Browne arrived, and running alongside the family's desperate attempts to be heard, there was a voice coming from a place of uniquely personal, moral authority. It arrived not through a public platform or a dramatic confrontation, but in the form of a written letter. The letter came from a woman named Pastor Valerie Hartwell, and what made her voice singular in this story was not her ministry profile, but her personal circumstances. Valerie Hartwell was also a widow. Her husband, Senior Pastor Roy Hartwell, had passed away in March of 2023. She knew from the direct, lived, daily experience of loss what it meant to be a widow navigating grief while still carrying responsibility for a ministry and a family. She was not speaking theoretically or from the outside. She was speaking from inside the same kind of wound. Pastor Hartwell wrote to Joni, widow to widow. She described communicating back and forth with her and stated that she had written to Joni directly in November 2023 about her deep concerns regarding the marriage. In that letter, she pointed to the timeline with clarity and bluntness. She called out what she saw without softening it for palatability. She named what Doug's behavior looked like from the outside, the speed of the divorce, the proximity to Marcus's death, the professional irony of a marriage counselor ending his own decades-long marriage while simultaneously presenting himself as a suitable partner for a grieving widow. She wrote of Doug Weiss, "I called Dr. Doug, as you like to call him, for not giving you and your children adequate time to grieve and transition from the loss of their father and grandfather before jumping into a new relationship. But she went further than the timeline. She addressed the credibility question at its core. Doug Weiss had built his entire professional identity and public platform on helping couples save their marriages, heal from sexual betrayal, and restore intimacy. He had authored more than 40 books on exactly those subjects. He had built a nationally recognized counseling center around them, and he possessed both the professional tools and the biblical framework that, by his own publicly stated theory, should have made it possible to fight for his own marriage, rather than end it with unusual speed immediately after a prominent widow's husband died. The concern that he had used his expertise, his deep knowledge of grief, emotional vulnerability, attachment, and the psychology of loss, to build a connection with Joni during the most fragile period of her life was not a paranoid speculation. It was a reasonable, documented concern raised by multiple credible voices. Valerie Hartwell articulated it plainly and refused to dress it up. Her language was direct because she believed the moment required it. She wrote, "As a psychologist, Doug should have known better than to encroach on a grieving family and widow so early. This is shame on him, but double shame on you as a mother, grandmother, and president of Daystar for allowing this unsavory, ungodly marriage to occur that has fractured your family and Daystar." Those are not comfortable words. They are not words that leave room for a polite non-engagement. They are the words of someone who genuinely believed she was watching a preventable catastrophe unfold and was willing to say so clearly, at the risk of the relationship, because she cared more about the truth than the comfort of being liked. What is documented is that Valerie Hartwell's letter, like the warnings from Rodney Howard-Browne, like the pleas of her children, did not change Joni Lamb's course. There is no public record of Joni engaging with the substance of what Valerie wrote. There is no documented response that meaningfully addressed the timeline, the biblical questions, or the family concerns Valerie raised with such care and directness. There were also concerns being expressed, though not all publicly, by other prominent voices in the evangelical and charismatic world. The reference accounts note that Robert Morris, who was at that time the senior pastor of Gateway Church in Southlake, Texas, one of the largest and most influential megachurches in the country, reportedly agreed with Jonathan and Suzy that this relationship was not a wise or advisable decision. It is important to note that Robert Morris has since faced his own devastating accountability reckoning. In October 2025, he pleaded guilty to 5 felony counts of lewd or indecent acts with a child, stemming from incidents in the 1980s, and was sentenced to 10 years with 6 months of jail time, required to register as a lifetime sex offender, and ordered to pay $270,000 in restitution to his victim. His fall from pastoral authority has been total and irreversible. But at the time of the Joni Lamb situation, he was a figure of significant standing in the same ministry world, and his reported concern about this marriage was privately real, even if not publicly stated. There were also questions about Doug Weiss's public ministry statements that caused genuine discomfort among those in Christian ministry circles who heard them. The reference accounts specifically note concern about a statement Weiss had made in a public ministry context, that Jesus died for believers to have good sex. Whatever the intended theological framing of that remark, in the context of a network that had always maintained a conservative, family values broadcast image, and which was watched daily by millions of viewers across the full spectrum of evangelical and Pentecostal tradition, having the president of that network married to a man who made that kind of statement in public ministry settings raised real and legitimate credibility questions. Questions that no amount of warm, on-air chemistry between the new couple could fully resolve. And through all of it, every conversation, every letter, every face-to-face warning, every late-night phone call with a weeping child, the pattern was the same. What Jonathan, Suzy, and those close to Joni have consistently described in the months before the wedding was an atmosphere of increasing insulation. The people around Joni who told her what she wanted to hear were given more access. The people who raised genuine concerns found themselves pushed further and further toward the outside of the conversations that mattered. Their motives were questioned. Their discernment was labeled as fear. Their love was reframed as opposition. And the language used to shut them down was the most powerful language available inside a Christian institution, the language of divine calling. Because if God has led you to a decision, then anyone who questions that decision is not questioning your judgment. They are questioning God. That is an extraordinarily difficult position to argue against, and it was used systematically and repeatedly to silence the most important voices in Joni Lamb's life. On June 10th, 2023, Joni Lamb and Doug Weiss were married. Not one of her children was present. Not Jonathan, not Rachel, not Rebecca. 3 children who had grown up inside Daystar, who had built their adult professional lives inside that ministry, who had given years of genuine loyal service to the institution their parents had built together from nothing. Not a single one of them stood in the room when their mother remarried. That absence is its own complete chapter, written without a single additional word. What followed has been documented extensively. In a recorded 90-minute meeting that has since been made public by the Roy's report, Pastor Jimmy Evans met with Jonathan and Suzy and told Jonathan 11 times that his mother was the voice of God to him, labeling Jonathan's theological concerns about the marriage as witchcraft. That audio exists. People have listened to it. Suzy was fired on the spot during a live broadcast for refusing to read aloud a viewer comment that endorsed the marriage. Joni had insisted they could not decline to read it. Suzy declined anyway and was terminated immediately. Jonathan was placed on a formal performance improvement plan, had his salary reduced by 40%, was surveilled by a private investigator who followed him, and was later confronted on camera and had a GPS tracking device placed in his company vehicle without his knowledge. On November 16, 2024, he was terminated. A Daystar staff member named Shannon Kelly arrived at Jonathan and Suzy's home carrying a firearm and wearing a bulletproof vest to deliver the notice, footage of which was captured on their home security system and has been widely viewed. More than 30 major programming partners, including Joyce Meyer, Jack Hibbs, Greg Laurie, and Ray Comfort, departed Daystar throughout 2024 and 2025 as the accumulating scandal made their continued presence on the network untenable. A network that had once been home to some of the biggest names in American Christianity was watching those names quietly and publicly walk away, one after another. It is worth pausing here and sitting with what Valerie Hartwell's letter predicted and what the documented record now shows. She wrote that Joni's marriage to Doug had caused more harm than good, not just within the family, but to the legacy of Daystar itself, and that issues which might have remained private had been dragged irreversibly into the public eye as a direct result of the fallout from this one decision. Look at the state of Daystar in 2026. Joni gone at 65, the succession unresolved and in the hands of people, neither founder named, 30-plus ministry partners departed, a family estranged beyond repair in this life, Jonathan excluded from his own mother's memorial slideshow, a board member who reportedly received Joni's dying wish for reconciliation and then denied it in a text 2 days after the funeral. Valerie's letter feels less like a warning written in 2023 and more like an accurate description of exactly what the record now confirms. There is a principle at work in this story that transcends the specific family and the specific network, and it deserves to be said plainly because it matters to every person who watches it. The warnings Joni Lamb received were not small voices or fringe opinions. They came from family members who knew her most intimately and loved her most deeply. They came from a respected revivalist minister who delivered his warning to her face inside her own building with a clear and stated consequence. They came from a fellow widow who understood her grief from the inside and wrote to her from that place of shared experience and personal authority. They came from pastors, leaders, and trusted voices across the ministry world she had inhabited for 30 years. People who cared enough about her to speak clearly when silence would have been so much easier. Every single one of those warnings was heard, processed, and dismissed, labeled as fear, called faithlessness, reframed as interference rather than discernment. The language Joni Lamb used when she pointed at her grieving children and said, "Fear, fear, 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 fear," and walked out of the room to catch a plane, is not the language of someone who has genuinely engaged with a concern and thoughtfully disagreed. It is the language of someone who has already decided, completely, irrevocably, and for whom any external voice that does not confirm that decision has been pre-categorized as an obstacle rather than as wisdom. That kind of insulation does not happen overnight. It builds slowly, conversation by conversation, as those who affirm us are drawn closer and those who challenge us are pushed further away. It is one of the most common and most dangerous patterns in human leadership, and it is dramatically amplified inside Christian institutions where the language of divine calling can be weaponized to shut down accountability. If God told you to do something, then doubt is rebellion. Questions are faithlessness. Concern is a spirit of fear. And the people raising those concerns are not your counselors. They are your obstacles. It is one of the most effective ways human beings have ever found to insulate themselves from the truth. And in this case, it was used to silence the people who had the most right to be heard. Proverbs 11 verse 14 says, "Where there is no guidance, a people falls. But in an abundance of counselors, there is safety." Joni Lamb had an abundance of counselors. She had a revivalist pastor who came to her building and spoke face to face with unmistakable clarity. She had a widow who wrote to her from the interior of the same grief. She had 3 children who wept in her presence and begged her to stop and listen. She had the quiet, documented concerns of some of the most prominent names in the 30-year ministry world she had occupied. The guidance was there. The abundance of counsel was there. What was missing was the willingness to receive it. What this story ultimately asks of every person who watches it is a moment of honest, personal reflection, because none of us, not one, is immune to the same dynamic. All of us carry blind spots we cannot see clearly. All of us have areas of our lives where we have already decided, and where the voices that would challenge that decision are being slowly, quietly reclassified as negativity or interference or spiritual weakness. All of us have the capacity to build a circle of people who confirm us, rather than a circle of people who hold us accountable. The question Joni Lamb's story puts to each of us is simple and entirely serious. Who in your life has the actual freedom to tell you the truth? And when they do, what do you call it? Joni Lamb called it fear. She pointed at the people who loved her most, named their grief and their discernment as a spiritual problem, and walked out the door onto a plane to New York. And the story that grew from that moment, the fractured family, the fired son arriving home to a man in a bulletproof vest, the surveillance devices, the memorial slideshow with Jonathan's face erased from it, the dying wish that a board member has so far refused to honestly deliver, is the story of what gets built when the warnings go unheard. It is a sobering chapter in a long and complicated story. It is also a chapter that has not finished being written, because the institution Joni Lamb built and the family that carries her name are still here, still navigating the wreckage and the inheritance of the decisions she made. And the question of whether the people now in authority at Daystar will choose differently, whether they will surround themselves with truth tellers rather than affirmers, whether they will honor what the founders actually asked for, whether they will give millions of faithful, generous viewers an honest and transparent account of where the ministry stands, is a question this channel will continue to follow with full sourcing and full accountability. If this video has given you something to think about or reflect on, please share it with someone who has been following the Daystar story. Leave us a comment telling us which of the voices that tried to warn Joni you believe carried the most moral authority and why. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you receive our continued coverage as this story develops. There is more to come. We will be here when it arrives. God bless you. We will see you in the next one.